The papers trembled in her hand like a confession she couldn't quite remember writing. Divorce lay on the top sheet in plain black type, its edges sharpened by resolve and months of silence. Nicole Hart stared at the word as if it might rearrange itself into something softer. The ring on her finger had gone dull with the same years that had dulled conversation between her and Elliot Kingsley. Outside, rain polished the city into mirror-bright streaks. Inside, the Kingsley penthouse felt more like a courthouse than a home. She had brought the papers to him the night before with all the definite calm of someone who'd rehearsed a finale. Words were clipped, reasons more rehearsed than real. Asher had waited in the wings of her life like a promise she sometimes mistook for fate, their shared smiles in the old neighborhood, the echo of scraped knees and childhood dares. He had been waiting for a clean exit. Nicole thought she would go. Instead, the night had blurred into something clinging and wrong and tender all at once. Wine gone bad in the bottom of a glass, an argument that didn't know whether it wanted to end or begin, hands that found each other with a kind of desperate map reading. She remembered the way Elliot's jaw tightened when she said things she didn't mean. She remembered his hands steadying her when she swayed. She remembered a softness in his voice she had never admitted to missing. She remembered kissing him in a way that felt like apology and punishment at the same time. She woke up with an ache in her chest and the weight of the sheets around her like a sentinel. She did not remember everything. She remembered wanting to leave, but she also remembered the way he had held her when she started to sob, as if he were keeping her from falling through the floor. She could reach for the divorce then, make it simple and irreversible. Instead, she stood in the pale kitchen light, the papers in her hand, and folded them back into the envelope without signing. "I'm done," she had told him the night before, and then later, in the hush after wine and an argument and a moment that neither of them wanted to explain properly, she had said nothing at all. That was her reason for not signing, a decision that felt less like forgiveness and more like a pause. For everyone else, it would look like a retreat. For Asher, for the family, for the tabloids when they sniffed, it was confusing. For her, it was survival. She needed time to understand whether what had happened was an ending she wanted or a mirror of something else she'd been avoiding for years. If you love messy, slow-burn billionaire romances and twisty family drama, stay with this one a little longer. The morning after, the apartment smelled faintly of cigarettes. Someone always smoked on the balcony during storms, and of the lemon cleaner Lillian insisted on using despite everyone's complaints.
Elliot Kingsley moved like a man who'd learned early how to conceal tremor with posture. His custody of the room was precise. He folded his newspaper into a triangle and watched her, as if waiting for a crack to appear. "You're not signing them," he said, not a question. "No," she answered. The word accepted its own echo. Saying it aloud was not the same as meaning it. She had watched him for a long time, trying to catalog the ways they had worn each other down. She had loved the idea of Asher like a photograph you keep in a drawer and forget you own until you find it and remember every detail, softened by time. She had treated Elliot like a sculpture in a museum you liked from a distance, admired, untouchable, beautiful in bronze and affixed to a pedestal. But the pedestal had been lonely for both of them. Elliot did not move closer. He did not reach for the papers to sign them himself. He did what he had always done with difficult things. He turned them into action instead of surrender. "We need to talk," he said, properly, not like last night. She wanted to resist. She wanted to put the envelope in her bag, slip out the back door, find Asher waiting with the easy humor of someone who'd never had to be rich or careful. Instead, she sat and watched the rain bead on the window and understood, in a sliding, reluctant way, that whatever night had been had stripped more than reason. It had stripped away pretense. It had shown them, briefly, each other. The rest of the city did not pause for their internal weather. Morning feeds were merciless and efficient. In the Hart neighborhood, gossip traveled faster than good sense. The Hart family, bless them and sometimes damn them, were people who built their dramas on sound bites. Thomas Hart called at 11, voice thick with interest, not quite comfort. "Don't be a fool, Nico," he said. "You don't sign anything in emotional heat. Remember when I tried to sell the old garage to cover the back taxes? You were the one who put your foot down." She managed a humorless laugh. "This has nothing to do with the garage." He harmuffed. "Then why the staring? You look like someone who ate lemon and couldn't find sugar." Nicole had been ready for a parade of opinions, but her father's tone was both judgmental and complicit, the way family always is. No one wanted divorce to be neat. They preferred it to be righteous or petty, preferably with a good story attached. Across town, Asher Stewart woke in a rented apartment with the basil stains from the takeout on the counter, and his phone buzzing with a message from Nicole. "I'm not signing them." He read it twice, because he needed to believe it, like a superstition. He dressed with a businessman's impatience and drove to the old part of the city where he and Nicole had run their fingers across brick and dared each other to climb roofs when they were teenagers. He imagined her in the Kingsley penthouse, surrounded by marble and cold art. "You backed out?"
he said when she opened the door to him, wearing a sweatshirt she'd borrowed because it smelled of him and home. "Not backed out," she corrected. "Pausing." "Pausing?" He planted his hands on his hips like a man who had rehearsed condemnation. "Nico, you know that life with him is complicated," she supplied. It was a convenient word. He frowned at her like a man who couldn't reconcile pain with the person he loved. "You're playing with fire," Asher warned, but his eyes kept straying to the thin gold at her finger. There it was again, a map he could not read. Asher represented the life she had imagined for herself once: simplicity, predictable affection, the home with a creaky porch and a dog named Marley. Elliot represented everything she had avoided: power, distance, and a landscape of loneliness dressed as success. People in their circle had opinions and reasons for the way things had been. Zoe Hart, her cousin, sent a gift that said, "Good luck," with teeth that looked too pointed. Zoe's humor was sharp, and her alliance to convenience had always made her both a help and a hazard. Thomas Hart's deaths, quietly nurtured, had been a shadow in the background for years. He had made choices that left the family in lines of obligation and resentment. For a family who liked to live loudly, they had the economy of silence down to a science. At the center of all of this stood a man whose quiet irritated a great many people: Elliot Kingsley. His headlines always had the same tone: cool, distant, prince of a corporation. People loved to tell the story of the cold billionaire who married down, as if marriage could be reduced to a currency exchange. What they didn't know was that Elliot had kept a low-burning devotion to Nicole for a long time. Not a dramatic confession, but a daily, private choreography of small touchstones that, if someone had bothered to look, would have read like evidence. She found one such touchstone that week almost by accident. Lillian, Elliot's executive assistant, who spoke in clipped sentences and loaded teacups, left a folder on the counter labeled with a childish handwriting Nicole half recognized. "Don't snoop," Lillian said, with the delicacy of someone who'd spent a decade learning to put boundaries where no one else cared to. Nicole hesitated. She slid the folder open and found photographs that made her stomach flip. Old Polaroids from places she'd forgotten they'd visited together, a ticket stub from the art installation she had raved about 8 years ago, a note in Elliot's handwriting that read in small, deliberate letters, "For when you doubt me." It hissed beneath her ribs. It was small, ridiculous, and the kind of thing that could be dismissed as obsessive or romantic depending on which side of the coin you wanted. She let herself be angry for reasons that felt both childish and entirely hers. Why keep these things? Why keep a record like that if he couldn't name them in public? Why did Elliot's devotion live in paper when it should have been in his mouth? That night she confronted him with the folder in hand, as if it were a weapon. "Is this meant for me?" she asked. Elliot's face in the dim light of the study was a lesson in control. He had the kind of face that learned to be weatherproof early on, as if patterns of disappointment could be brickwork. "I never wanted you to find it like that." "So it's a secret? A private archive of Nicole moments?" Her voice rose, not entirely a demand and not entirely a plea. He reached for his glass but set it down again. "I kept notes," he said simply. "Not because I wanted anything, but because I promised myself I would remember why I loved you." The explanation landed somewhere between confession and practicality, and if words could be surgical, they certainly cut and bled and reset. She saw for the first time in years the man who had watched her from a distance and not been able to cross a line he thought would hurt her more by crossing. It was absurd and poignant in equal measure. The billionaire who wrote down her laugh and saved wrapper paper from the chocolates she liked. "Why didn't you tell me?" she asked. "Sometimes the truth sits heavy," he said. "Sometimes I thought my words would feel like an accusation, or worse, pressure. I thought my keeping them would be a gift. That was a ridiculous decision." It was at once an apology and an indictment. She wanted to be angry with him for the secret-keeping, but in the folds of that confession was the thing she'd been missing: evidence that Elliot's heart was not as brittle as people assumed. 10 years was not merely a number. It was a slow architecture of choice. If a decade's worth of little things could be reduced to a man with a habit of saving ticket stubs, then love for Elliot had been more of a construction than an accident. It explained the quiet ways he protected her, the calls that went through the night,
the aide he sent once to nurse a cold when she'd been too proud to call for help. It still didn't explain everything, but it made the idea of walking away feel suddenly short-sighted. And then there were bigger things than souvenirs. The whisper of threat that had been moving through the Kingsley corridors for months, a tremor beneath the marble floors. People at the company said the name John Lang like a weather report. Lang, the shadow on the board who wore charm like a coat and had a habitude of closing deals with a smile, had been threading his way through the fiduciary seams of Kingsley Group. If the company was an island, Lang was a man building bridges to the mainland he didn't own. Someone had been meddling with the medicine. At first it was a rumor, an old man with blurred lists and a hand that forgot to press the cup against his lips. Grandfather Kingsley, Edmund Kingsley, was a patriarch by title and a patient by need.
He had always been a slow-motion presence in the family story, sharp when he wanted and forgetful when he didn't. When he missed a dose or took two at once, they chalked it up to age. When his numbers dropped with alarming speed, the doctors muttered about interactions and contamination. Then a lab tech whispered, the way a secret is given when the stakes are high. There was a banned substance in his meds. The words were precise and clinical. Poison was a dirty word in a wealthy house because it made vulnerability tangible. Elliot, who hid tremors under the iron of his voice, closed like a cave opening. He ordered tests, demanded records, and for the first time in the week he looked worn, because the fight was no longer private. It was risking something larger than either of them: Kingsley legacy, reputation, the company that put ghosts in the vault. Nicole, who had come to the penthouse with an unwillingness to be party to public spectacle, found herself in the sterile blue world of the hospital, a place she had associated with endings more than with explanations. Lillian hovered with the kind of loyalty that men and money cannot buy. The lab reported anomalies. A compound that should not have been in prescribed medications had been detected in trace amounts. It was a professional finding with an ugly implication. Sabotage was not only possible, it was probable. Elliot's father-in-law, Thomas Hart, called and wondered aloud whether the Hart money ever really protected anyone. Zoe sent a message that was equal parts support and performance. Asher, when he learned of it, showed a tenderness that belonged to the safer version of himself, and a fury that belonged to a man who might be used as a weapon. They would do this, he muttered, looking at the hospital's pale walls. He spoke of enemies in polite terms, but his voice trembled with anger. Who would want to hurt him? Nicole asked. People who want control, Elliot said. People who see fear in markets and take it as an opportunity. It was a deliberate answer. He didn't say John Lang's name. He didn't need to. In the Kingsley room, the air was electric and careful. Elliot's hands did not tremble when he typed commands into a phone to trace recent visitors and meals. He was a man who knew how to build fences after they were already burning. Nicole found herself in places she never intended to be. The small, fluorescent-lit laboratory where a technician set out vials like evidence for a courtroom. The boardroom where suits spoke in diagrams and the word leverage was used like a prayer. She listened to men talk about numbers with the kind of affection they reserved for children. It didn't come from the pharmacy, the technician said. The pills were tampered with after they were filled. Tampered with it was then. Someone had infiltrated a process that should have been secure. It was personal because family was enmeshed with business in a way that made betrayal look like an efficient transaction. He tightened his jaw, and she watched him move through the factual world as if it were a chessboard, and he had already seen a few moves ahead. Bill of lading checks tomorrow, full audit of meal services, visitor logs for the last month. Everyone logged will be checked, Elliot said. No one leaves until we see who touched what. The assertion was not a threat so much as protocol. He insisted on procedures because he couldn't afford rumor to decide the company's fate. He couldn't afford to let inheritance dissolve into scandal. Nicole surprised herself when she volunteered to help. It was not that she suddenly wanted to be a detective. It was that the thing that had frightened her most, losing any sense of agency, revolted her now more than the modest comfort of stepping out of the Kingsley narrative. Helping meant she had a tool that was hers, a way to be useful that had nothing to do with ring size or social episodes. I can sit in on interviews, she offered. I know how to listen. He looked at her then in a way that was unreadable and, for the first time since they'd married, openly vulnerable. You sure? I'm sure, she said. It felt like a small bargain. She would offer something and in return would be given access to the redundancy of his world. It wasn't romantic, it was practical. But in Elliot's small, contained smile was a flicker that made the cup think of her leave rearranged shards. That old devotion didn't bloom solely in saved stubs and quiet notes. It blossomed in trust given in the middle of crisis. In the week that followed, they became a pair of annoying, efficient irritants, him asking for timelines and her watching the way his eyebrows crinkled when he was thinking. They walked through the hospital corridors like adversaries trying to be allies. It was their awkwardness that made them plausible as partners. Outsiders called them the pair with a kind of weary fascination reserved for celebrities who married beneath their class and survived. Asher watched from the fringe, a man with legitimate grievance and inadequate options. He had the kind of love built more on memory than on present affection. There was a softness in him that made people forgive him small sins, but he also kept secrets that made him dangerous, or at least malleable. He had debts and ambitions that made him useful to people like John Lang. Lang didn't need to seduce him. He needed someone who could be tempted, someone who thought the world owed him. When a warehouse receipt turned up with a signature that matched a delivery to the Kingsley estate the night before Grandfather's collapse, it sent the small, precise gears of Elliot's investigation into an angry whirl. There were questions. Who had access to the kitchen staff? Who had access to the med cabinet? Who could override a career lock?
The answer, when the first set of names sifted down, read like a who's who of surprise. Zoe's temporary assistant had a brother who had been laid off months ago. Thomas Hart's old contractor had been nursing a grudge. Lang, meanwhile, wore composure like armor, smiling at meetings with a slow empathy that suggested he had always been the reasonable one. But reasonable people sometimes had the best rehearsed smiles. As Elliot worked, his hands moved with a kind of grace that came from practice. He made phone calls that closed doors. He sent men in suits to track down temp IDs and digital footprints. He sat in conference rooms and spoke in the measured tone of someone who knew the weight of a sentence in public. He did not indulge in dramaturmo. He indulged in control. Nicole, who had once been tempted to leave for the simpler life, watched him from the side and felt a strange recalibration. The notebook with Polaroids and tickets no longer looked like a secret hoarding. It looked like evidence of a man who had chosen to remember when it would have been easier to forget. Memory as devotion. The more she saw of his small acts, the less sure she was of the sharpness of her earlier plan. She started keeping notes too, not a hoarding, but a ledger of small wonderings. A man who changed his route home to avoid a group of paparazzi. A call he made at midnight to a private nurse. A bouquet of flowers that appeared in a corridor on a Tuesday afternoon with a sticky note that said, "For when you need proof that someone notices." "You're getting sentimental," Asher told her one evening when they sat on a bench outside a cafe that smelled of espresso and regrets. He watched her with a kind of impatience that loves a battle. "Or I'm finally paying attention," Nicole said. "There's a difference." He patted her hand, a gesture both intimate and territorial. "Don't pretend you don't see how this looks. People will assume." "That I sold out to a billionaire?" She smiled, but she was not unafraid. "Perhaps they will. Or perhaps they'll assume I have good taste in men with resources." He laughed, then grew suddenly sober. "Just don't get played, Nico. You know how the game works." She nodded and then turned the conversation toward specifics, because specifics are what give people footing. They talked about the possibility of corporate sabotage. They talked about Lang. They talked about whether this was personal or strategic. Asher's voice was a blend of care and assertion, the kind of solidity she had always used like a blanket when the nights were cold. There was one thing she noticed that no one else did at first. Old Edmund Kingsley's ledger had a blot of ink on a page devoted to the Westmere land. The ink suggested arguments. The Westmere property was exactly the kind of asset third parties would prize, a parcel with timber rights and frontage, whatever else a corporation could flip for a power play. The possibility that someone wanted the land for its leverage made fingers point in the direction of a takeover. "You think Lang wants it?" she asked Elliot quietly one night as they sat at the kitchen island, a space that had once hosted their awkward attempts at dinner conversation. "I think Lang wants leverage," he said. "Westmere is leverage. So is a scandal." His calm was a mask, always, but beneath it was an urgency that made the marble of the island feel colder than it should have been. Threats to property and reputation didn't just impact balance sheets, they changed the trajectories of people's lives. For someone like Elliot, whose face had become a brand, the risk was not just financial, it was existential. Nicole's memory of the night that had nearly ended them began to sharpen in unnatural ways. It became less like a smear and more like a painting with broad strokes she had been avoiding. She could see now how the night had been a hinge. It had not forced her hand, it had merely exposed her to a truth she had been avoiding, that she had always measured things by comfort and not by courage, by the possibility of a predictable life, and not by the messy, demanding work of choosing someone who might actually try. And Elliot's decade of small devotion was not a bargaining chip, It was a slow revelation of a man who had not been absent by neglect, but by calculation. He had chosen silence because he believed it would make her feel freer. That was a terrible excuse, but the effect of it was real. She felt angry at him and grateful at the same time, an awkward emotional geography she hadn't expected to map. The board meetings began to take on a tenor she recognized from financial dramas and private tragedies. Men in gray suits presented slides. Women in sharper colors listened. Lang smiled and made the right noises. He was, in public, everything an antagonist should be: charming, logical, patient. If you asked him in a cocktail hour whether he'd consider himself ruthless, he'd likely laugh and say no. But people who operate on leverage rarely call themselves ruthless. They call themselves strategic. He orchestrated small things like the rearrangement of shareholders, quiet moves that, if repeated, created a majority. He made friends of men with the kind of hunger that would slide under a tablecloth and rearrange the silverware. It was strategic gamekeeping that people like Elliot could see but rarely needed to name. Nicole read the headlines and the op-eds and felt the slow piling up of pressure. Rumors, especially the kind that involve wealth and weakness, are like seeds. Once planted, they grow in everyone else's file and demand attention. One afternoon, while sifting through interviews and testimony for inconsistencies, Nicole found a voice memo on a staff phone left by mistake. It was, she realized, the kind of accident that novels plan dramatically and that in real life people ignore.
The recording was a clipped, nervous voice, someone talking about a delivery that had been messed with. The voice used no names, but mentioned the time and a detail she recognized from the hospital records. She saved the file to a secure folder on a laptop, feeling for a moment like an accomplice to something larger than a domestic spat. When she played it for Elliot, he listened with a kind of attention that felt like plexiglass, clear and unbreakable. He did not shout, he did not call for arrests. He simply arranged for the lab to cross-reference the times with the staff logs. "We take this carefully," he said. "We?" she asked, amused and a little chastened. He looked at her as if the answer were obvious. "You and me, Nicole. Right now, it's you and me." There it was, the scaffolding of an alliance. She had regretted the intimacy of the night, but she had not regretted the presence it had forced upon them, the presence of being a unit, however reluctantly formed. It felt treacherous and necessary. As the days unspooled, they tested each other's boundaries in small ways. He set conditions on public appearances. She refused to be a prop. He asked if she would stay in the house for a month while they reorganized safety protocols, and she said she would. He was both grateful and apologetic for the demand. They made compromises that read like a truce. She would sit through a board meeting. He would let her have a vote in some small household decisions. It was during one of those meetings that Elliot dropped a sentence that made Nicole's shoulders tighten with warmth and something unreadable. "I've been keeping a list," he said, as if confessing a hobby, "of things that matter, of reasons to be patient. It has a name I don't use in meetings because I'm afraid of how it sounds." "What name?" she asked. He hesitated. "Nico's list." The innocuousness of the label made her laugh, a sound that startled both of them. "That's less ominous than I expected," she said. He smiled the way he did when amusement was private. "It started as a way to remember things when I thought I might lose them, but then I realized the list was really for me, a reminder that people are reasons to choose." She found herself looking at him with the old map of childhood and the new geography of corporate war. This man, who had always been praised for his strategic mind, had been quietly keeping reasons to love her in a folder no one saw. It was sentimental in a way that threatened to undo her resolve. And yet the world outside their tentative alliance grew darker. A staff member resigned with haste, and a rumor that the Kingsley kitchen had been infiltrated made its way into the gossip columns. John Lang's name surfaced in quiet conversations about shareholder meetings. The sense that someone wanted not just the company but the family to fracture became a steady drumbeat. Nicole threw herself into the investigation with a clarity she hadn't known she possessed.
She learned to listen for what wasn't said, to spot the way a person avoided a date or repeated a word too often. She tapped into a patient detective inside her that had been dulled by years of habit, but emerged when the stakes were real. When she called Asher one night to tell him about a suspicious invoice and found him oddly defensive, she felt a prickle of old jealousy that was less about loss and more about being sidelined in a life she'd half walked away from. He asked whether she was safe. His voice carried an implied accusation. "Why would you stick around for the thing that could hurt you?" "Because some things are worth staying for," she told him. It wasn't all truth, but neither was it a lie. It was a statement of possibility. Celia, the lab tech, found a lead that no one expected: unusual fingerprints on a medication blister pack. The print matched a delivery driver's name that had popped up in Thomas Hart's old ledger. It was a small thread, but enough to tug at an unraveling seam. When Elliot looked at the list of names, his face assumed that famous calm. He prioritized, strategized, and then he surprised her by turning and asking, "Do you want to go with me to see the driver?" "I do," she said. She went because she wanted to be useful and because she wanted proof, not of love, but of the truth that things do not always align with stories. She sat beside him in an interrogation room that smelled of disinfectant and spent a long time listening to a man who was nothing but a cog. "Is someone paying you?" she asked. He shrugged, exhausted. "It's complicated." Complicated, she thought, was the entire biography of people who love and who inherit love with danger. She felt the world tilt in the way it does when a door opens on a new horizon. They left with another name and another question. Lang's people always had a way of moving through rooms like they owned the air. He smiled at them once in a hallway, and the greeting was flirtatious enough to be weaponized. He had a collection of admirers and quiet enforcers who would, if the price was right, move a chess piece for him. It was at the point where the threads began to knot that Elliot did something irreducibly human. He invited Nicole to stay for the 3 months he said would protect them financially while the board was reorganized. He didn't call it a challenge or a gamble. He called it a period, a time-ordered petition for them to stabilize things. "Consider it a trial," he said. 3 months of proving things to the board, to investors, to everyone who doubts us. She could see how it looked. A test, a challenge, a way to measure loyalty. Asher's jaw tightened when she told him. "Is this a trap?" he asked. "Is he just trying to bind you?" "It might be," she admitted. "It might also be a way to make sure we don't lose everything." The truth landed between them like a coin on a table. Maybe it would buy her time to decide.
Maybe it would cost her more than she had bargained for. Elliot's face, in the dim light of their kitchen, looked less like a mask and more like a map of choices. "Stay because you want to," he said, "not because you think it's expected." "That's fair," she replied. She liked, secretly, that he asked for consent like a man who had learned that people are not rooms to be assigned, but partners to be consulted. She agreed to the 3-month period with the kind of pragmatism that would have once made Asher laugh. It was not an impulsive surrender. It was a plan with an exit clause and a timeline, and, she admitted to herself, a dawning curiosity about the man who had kept a list of reasons. The days between decision and action swelled with small missions, checking courier logs, cross-referencing meal services, re-auditing senior staff expenses. They worked together with a clumsy domestic choreography, Elliot leading corporate steps, Nicole stepping into the rhythm with ease she hadn't expected. Their proximity did not feel like a capitulation. It felt like a careful truce. But where there is a truce, there is also a possibility for betrayal. When Asher got a call in the middle of the night and left without explanation, Nicole's chest tightened with an old familiar fear. She wanted to chase him, to demand why he couldn't be good in ways that mattered. Instead, she buried herself in paperwork and attendance logs. Practicality was the safest weapon she had. One of the last things she did before the 3 months began was a petty act that felt like a test of her own resolve. She took out the divorce papers she had tucked back in an envelope and stared at them under the light of the kitchen. The word divorce had dulled on the page. She had not signed them. She folded them, put them in an old book, and slid the book onto a shelf in Elliot's office, where she thought only he would find it. When he saw her put them there, he didn't scold. He didn't demand explanation. He watched her with a tenderness that had nothing to do with magnanimity and everything to do with a man who had been counting reasons. After that night, she never mentioned divorce again, he said, almost to himself. Nicole looked at him and felt a warmth that was not entirely comfortable. The sentence had the weight of prophecy. It wasn't that she was suddenly certain. It was that she had decided to allow the possibility of being uncertain in a more honest way. They moved, then, into a cadence. Board meetings in the morning, investigations by afternoon, appearances in the evening when necessary. The city continued to hum with rumor and accusation. John Lang continued to smile in the right places. And in the middle of it all, small things multiplied into evidence that went beyond sentiment. A security camera, cleaned and checked, revealed a shadow by the medication cabinet at odd hours. A delivery manifest showed a slight change in route logs.
A temp's resignation letter hinted at money that had not been accounted for. Each piece on its own was a rumor. Together, they started to make a picture. Nicole found herself at a moment of choice, not unlike the one she'd faced with the divorce papers. She had accepted to stay for 3 months. She had promised to help. She had accepted that Elliot's devotion, once hidden in old ticket stubs and careful notes, was real, not because it was grand, but because it was steady. And yet, the first round of inquiries uncovered something darker than anyone had predicted. A deliberate, methodical attempt to destabilize Kingsley by attacking the very things that kept its legacy intact: the health of its elder, the trust of its shareholders, the security of its assets. When the lab called with the second set of results, the word they used was precise and unavoidable: contamination. Elliot closed his eyes, and for a moment his composed face revealed a fissure. He looked at Nicole, and in that silent exchange, she knew that whatever victory lay at the end of the 3 months would not be about a green light in a shareholder meeting. It would be about proving that their family, their property, and their dignity could be salvaged from the hands of men who thought manipulation was a legitimate currency. She squeezed his hand that night without thinking, and when he looked at her, there was no grand speech, no promise beyond the quiet truth of being seen. "I'm not signing," she reminded herself and him. Not yet, but also not ever again with the same casualness of withdrawal. They had, between them, chosen to step onto a battlefield neither had invited, and for the first time it felt like something they would hold together or break trying. The 3 months promised order and momentum, but it could not promise safety. It could not guarantee the end of whispers or the arrest of greedy men. It could only promise that they would try. The inquiry would move towards the pharmacy that had filled Edmund Kingsley's prescription. It would lead to temp agencies and courier logs, and a cleaning crew with more knowledge than expected. It would bring them to a point where alliances would be revealed not as clear betrayals, but as tangle lines of need. John Lang would continue to smile. Asher would continue to lurk in the periphery. Zoe would continue to skate the edges of loyalty. Thomas Hart's past compromises would smell of ink and old regret. And Nicole, who had once thought divorce was the final, decisive act that would clear her life at the police sweep, learned that endings were not always as tidy. She learned that staying could be an act of courage, and that evidence of devotion was not always a grand confession. It could be a folder on a counter, or a note tucked into a book. They had a lot of work ahead. The files piled up. A new name, repeated across manifests, pulsed like a clue. Lang's people had fingers in places no one had thought to look. They had to watch.
They had to listen. They had to make sure that the truth would be more interesting than rumor. The first week of the 3-month period closed with a small victory, an invoice flagged as suspicious, a temp whose story didn't add up. They widened the probe and tightened the house security. Elliot ordered new locks for the service entrances, a round-the-clock audit of meal deliveries, and a discreet camera sweep of the staff corridors. He hired an outside forensics team with a reputation for not missing a smudge of evidence. He did it quietly, without the press release that would have given Lang the exact drama he wanted. It was what he did best: tighten the circle, illuminate the seams, and wait for human error to show itself. That night, when the penthouse was quieter than usual, and the rain had long since tapered into a drizzle, Nicole sat with a file of timestamps and a cup of tea that had gone cold. There was a new steadiness to her, less the brittle armor of someone ready to flee, more of someone who had found a weapon she could wield: attention. She read the manifest again and again, mapping the deliveries onto the family calendar, annotating odd overlaps and times when staff rosters didn't match footage. When the forensics team reported back, their findings were precise enough to be a blade. The tampering had not been a one-off. It had required access to both the kitchen and the pharmacy shipments, two places that, on paper, should have been hermetically separated. Someone had shadowed the meals the night grandfather collapsed, switched a blister pack during a routine tray change, and left no fingerprints of easy confession. But technology and a stubborn technician found a particle of a compound not manufactured in their lab. It was traced back to a supplier several towns over. Someone had ordered it in micrograms and paid cash. "Cash buys a lot," Elliot said softly when he told her, "but it leaves a trail." "Like a confession," she replied. It wasn't the most comforting image, but it was a useful one. They started with a small victory. The courier who had delivered the packet the night of the collapse had, in fact, been paid twice by 2 different accounts. One account led to a shell entity with ties to a holding company that, indirectly, existed in Lang's sphere. The other account carried a signature the forensics team couldn't yet place. It was the kind of spiderweb that took time to see from above.
Nicole found herself spending long hours at Elliot's side in ways that had nothing to do with marriage and everything to do with being on the same team. She learned how to read board minutes, how to map a company's shift and shareholder alliances, how to detect a planted opinion piece. It surprised her how quickly a woman who had once thought divorce was an endpoint became competent at navigating corporate espionage. Each skill she acquired felt less like labor and more like an act of defiance against being written off.
Asher, meanwhile, kept orbiting her life like a satellite on a predictable trajectory. He called frequently, alternating between tenderness and impatience. Sometimes he was a steady rock. He arranged private security for Zoe. He tracked down a witness who had been at a gala the night of a suspicious delivery, and he translated the street-level gossip into useful leads. At other times, he was the boy who wanted to be the hero in every scene, bristling when the limelight didn't center on him. Then, one morning, Nicole received a text that made the world narrow. Asher had been attacked on his way home. The message was short and full of holes. Someone had knocked him down an alley. He'd been left with a cracked jaw, a fractured phone screen, and a frightened paternity for his own choices. He was hospitalized not far from the Kingsley hospital wing, bruised and angry, refusing to give many details. When she went to see him, the sight of him, bandaged, Spitfire voice dulled, stirred something she hadn't expected. "They tried to frighten me," he said, between gritted teeth. "Said it was a message. Lang's people are good at messages." "Did you tell the police?" she asked. Asher shrugged. "Barely. I don't trust cops right now. Too many fingers in pockets." "Trust me," Nicole said. "Trust Elliot." He gave her a look that was equal parts wounded and insulted. "Trust him? Nico, this is his world. If Lang wanted me out, he'd make sure someone did it who never got traced." "Then help us trace it," she said. "Give the police everything. If Lang's people are reaching for anyone close to you, you can't walk away." A silence settled between them. He had been her childhood compass, the man who had pointed her towards simpler horizons. Now he was a man with claws and debts, a useful but dangerous ally. His involvement complicated things, emotionally and practically. She left him in a hospital bed making promises that sounded like plans, appear in statements, meet with security, and felt a guilt she couldn't entirely map. Love, she found, was naughty when real people were involved. The attacks and the leaks should have punched a hole in Elliot's composure, but what surprised Nicole was how he responded. With ruthless prioritization, and then with a tenderness that looked less like slapping a bandage on problems and more like tending every wound carefully. He attended to board meetings in the daytime and to the details of meal service at night. He made sure the nurses checking on Edmund wore lanyards with updated credentials. He learned the names of the kitchen staff, the ones who had worked the night of the tampering, and he bought them coffee without being patronizing. People noticed that, Lillian told Nicole on one of those late nights when the staff lounge smelled like burnt sugar. "It looks like management," Nicole said. "It looks like a man who remembers things," Lillian corrected.
And people like that. It was, Nicole realized, another layer of evidence. Elliot's devotion wasn't merely a private list. It was a pattern. He paid attention to details other rich men thought uninteresting because he had learned that details were where people lived. If he loved her via ticket stubs and notes, he loved the world in minor acts too. That thought warmed and irritated her at the same time. It wasn't the sweeping romance she'd once daydreamed about. No sweeping confessions in public, no cinematic declarations on a rain-swept bridge. It was quieter. It was real. The turning point in the investigation came when Nicole found a file she hadn't expected to see. It was buried deep in a secure folder on a server she had been permitted to review. An innocuous set of voice recordings from a company meeting that had been flagged as noise. Elliot hadn't asked her to listen. She clicked on the file because curiosity had become a magnet, and what played through her headphones made her stomach drop. It was John Lang's voice. Crisp, rehearsed, the cadence of someone who knew how to sell a narrative. He spoke in half sentences about accelerating a change in stewardship and creating manageable crises. Then, almost in a throwaway tone, he said, "We can't have Edmund live long enough to complicate the Westmere settlement." The phrase landed like a hammer. Nicole sat very still as the recording continued. Lang's voice was surrounded by others, men and women who coughed, who agreed in low voices, who arranged logistics like a production team. It was chilling in its intimacy, a conversation that assumed anatomical removal and economic upheaval as normal tools. It was the confession she hadn't expected to find in a company's cache, the kind of thing journalists dream of but rarely get in their inbox. She called Elliot immediately. He answered on the second ring. "I need you to come here," she said, voice low. He didn't ask what. He simply arrived, a silhouette in a shirt that looked like it had been pressed by gold. They listened together, heads bent, the recording playing again and again in that small, merciless loop. Lillian hovered nearby, her mouth a thin line of fury. "This is enough," Elliot said finally.
We go to the police now. No, Nicole said before she could stop herself. We go to the board first. He looked at her, puzzled. Why the board? Because if we go to the police without the leverage they need, the recordings, the lab results, Lang will have us painted as hysterical. He'll buy time. He's built a narrative machine. We unmask him where he operates publicly. We use their own procedures against them. He considered this, his jaw working. You want a shareholder's coup staged. I want people who do what Lang does to be shown for what they've done. Make it visible. It was audacious, risky. A police investigation would be slower. The boardroom could be immediate.
She suggested a plan. Present the recording to the board's ethics committee during a scheduled meeting where a quorum would be present. Confront Lang publicly with the evidence, force him into a corner and into confession or panic. If they failed, they'd have to go to the cops anyway. If they succeeded, they'd halt a takeover in its tracks. Elliot listened to her pitch with the same careful attention he paid to his children's school reports. When she finished, he nodded. Bring the forensics and the audio timestamps. Bring the lab's chain of custody. We need paper that doesn't lie. We'll get it, she promised. They worked in concert, assembling everything. The recording, the lab reports that showed the compound's trace origin, the delivery manifests with anomalous signatures, the security footage that showed a shadow at the med cabinet, corroborating testimony from the temp who had resigned in a panic. They had a dossier that read like a file the police would drool over. On the day of the board meeting, the Kingsley boardroom looked like a stage. Journalists were kept at a distance. A live stream of the public portion would later show staged outrage and quiet triumph, depending on the channel. Elliot walked in with Nicole at his side, not as a prop, but as a partner. Lillian sat nearby like a woman who had held the company's spine together with rubber bands and sharp words. Lang entered with his practiced smile, an animal that knew the rules of decorum and would use them as camouflage. The confrontation was surgical. Elliot presented the chain of custody documents. Nicole played the recording. The room listened as Lang's voice echoed off polished wood. Board members shifted in their seats, some blanching, some attempting to compose themselves. Lang's smile didn't flicker at first. Then it did. A small, involuntary thing that betrayed a fraying method. You can't just play edited files in a boardroom, Lang said, voice smooth. We can, Elliot replied. And we have the originals in more than one location. We have a lab's confirmation on the compound. We have delivery records and witness statements. Lang's hands tightened around his notes. This is hearsay. It is also evidence, Nicole said, surprising herself with how steady she sounded. It is also a statement of intent. You spoke of removing Edmund as if he were an obstacle. That is a criminal conspiracy. The room went quiet enough to hear the tick of a clock somewhere distant. Lang's first move was classic: denial, charm, then accusation. He accused Elliot of manufacturing documents. He invoked hostile shareholders and ambitious executives who opposed him. A heated exchange followed, the kind of theatrics that made for good headlines. But Elliot had prepared for theatrics. He unfurled the deliverable. A witness would corroborate the audio file.
A courier who had been paid by a shell company and who now, presented with a lawyer and time-limited immunity, told an abbreviated truth. If any of you believe this is a boardroom spectacle, Lillian said then, voice cold and precise, then the question is not whether John Lang wanted to destabilize Kingsley. The question is whether you want to be complicit by believing none of the evidence in front of you. Her words landed like iron. Board members shuffled papers, alliances recalibrated. Lang's smile grew taut. Someone called an adjournment, ostensibly to consult legal counsel, but the mood had shifted. When the session reconvened, the chair announced an emergency vote to place Lang on immediate leave pending an independent investigation and to call in law enforcement for a parallel criminal inquiry. Lang stormed out, his composure shattered enough that his staff had to shepherd him from the room. Cameras captured the moment, social feeds exploded. The world that liked to reduce Kingsley drama to billionaire soap opera had its moment. But behind the spectacle, something more profound shifted. The narrative had been flipped. Lang's attempted quiet chaos had been rendered visible, and visibility had teeth. There were immediate repercussions. Detectives took statements. The forensics team expanded into a full criminal investigation. Lang's phone was subpoenaed. Investors demanded quick action. The board's support for Elliot solidified in the face of a clear and present threat. In the days that followed, arrests were made, not of Lang at once, but of his key operatives. A temp who had acted as courier, a kitchen supervisor who had been bribed, a man on the payroll with a clean criminal record and a sudden motivation. Lang himself fought back. Lawyers wrote threatening letters, smear campaigns flickered in corners of the internet, and planted stories suggested that the Kingsleys were manipulating facts. But the evidence was dense and the legal net tightening. When Lang's voicemail was finally obtained under warrant, investigators found other incriminating conversations, an exchange that documented payments, an order approved for specialized compounds, a casual countenance about breaking things where necessary.
In time, law enforcement arrested Lang on charges of conspiracy, attempted poisoning, and fraud. The public unmasking was messy and ugly in its way, but it achieved the clarity Nicole had wanted. Lang's arrest did not erase the damage done. Edmund remained fragile. The family reputations had been battered, but it did start the process of accountability. It gave the Kingsleys a legal recourse beyond the theatricalities of a boardroom. Throughout the takedown, Elliot did the quiet things he had always done. He visited Edmund in the hospital. He stayed in the late hours organizing depositions, and he stayed closer to Nicole in ways that were both practical and tender. The small things mattered.
He sat with her during interviews, holding her hand when statements dredged up old fears. He brought her coffee at 3 a.m. when she was too wired to sleep, and made a point of learning the names of every detective who came through, asking thoughtful questions so that he could provide even marginal help. What changed for Nicole was not a single sweeping gesture. It was the accumulation of consistent behavior, his preparedness, his refusal to allow her agency to be subsumed by him, his way of asking for consent when plans affected her. It built into a realization she hadn't planned to allow. His devotion was not a secret cache of keepsakes only. It was a practice. It had been 10 years of choices, a decade where he chose to be there in small ways, day after day. She found a private moment to probe the story of his list again. He had been reluctant to tell the details of nights and tickets, but there were parts of his past she had been given by accident and parts he volunteered. Slight stories of lonely dinners where he had practiced asking her to dance. Small humiliations he had endured in boardrooms to protect a margin of privacy for her. The way he turned down an investor's invitation once because the event coincided with a call she had made years ago complaining about a locked bicycle. "It was never about me being perfect," he told her one night, as they sat in a security quiet lounge, the city's lights a ragged horizon. "It was about choosing to listen." 10 years is a lot of listening, she said. A lot of waiting, too, he admitted. And maybe fear. Fear of making you feel obligated. Fear of being mistaken for someone who needed to own rather than to love. "You made the choice not to be loud," she said. "That's a weird kind of protection." He nodded. "I thought silence would make it easier for you to leave if that's what you wanted. I was wrong." They both laughed, a small, soft thing that carried the weight of apology and acceptance. It was, in its way, as intimate as any kiss. There was admission and the mutual acceptance of imperfections. Once the criminal proceedings gained momentum and Lang's network started to disintegrate, the company turned to damage control. There were public hearings, testimony, and regulatory fines. It wasn't clean, and it wasn't pretty, but the legal system did what it could, and that was important. It showed that money couldn't simply erase criminality if people were determined to find truth. During a televised hearing, a chemist testified about the compound's origin and the chain of custody. A courier, granted immunity, described going to a shed where packages were assembled with care and malice. The temp wrote a statement that read like a confession. Lang's lawyers tried to pivot to suggest that Elliot had motives for fabricating evidence.
But when the board presented the recording in a public hearing and asked observers to judge its veracity, the public, for once, saw the architecture of deception. Nicole played a part in the hearings, giving testimony about the exchange of messages she'd found, about the manifest irregularities she'd noticed. She did it not as a wife who had been saved, but as a participant who had assembled a case. Her words were precise because she had studied them, but they were not merely rehearsed. They came from a woman who had decided to be present. Her testimony had weight. It was one thing to have a billionaire husband accuse a rival. It was another for a woman once intent on divorce to step forward with proof that she had chosen to stay and to charge herself into the fray. Asher watched the hearings from the periphery, his jaw clenched. He had recovered enough to be present, and in public he looked chastened. Afterward, he found Nicole in a corridor outside the hearing room and pressed a note into her hand. "I'm sorry." The apology was small and human. He had been manipulated by others who had promised him debt relief in exchange for bending a rule or two. He had been naive, and he had paid for that naivete. He wanted to make amends in quiet ways, by testifying, by returning favors, by using his contacts in the right way. She forgave him with a complexity that acknowledged their shared past and separate futures. "You were used," she said, "but not every sin gets absolution with a handshake. Make it right." He did. He came to testify about the call he had received promising him quick profit for a small task.
He described the exchange with the kind of humiliation that made him human. The court listened. It was not romantic closure. It was messy accountability. With Lang's arrest and the arrests of his henchmen, a tidal wave of relief washed through the Kingsley house, tempered by the fact that legal processes take time and that some damage is irreparable. Edmund Kingsley's health stabilized but never returned to full strength. He had been scorched by the attempt, and the family carried the scars. The tabloids sniffed for melodrama. Family meetings were quieter, more deliberate. Nicole watched Elliot with new eyes, eyes that had been lured from a pedestal to a bedside and who saw the man. The romance had shifted. It had become less of a fairy tale and more of a partnership born of crisis. In the quiet days after the hearings began, Nicole allowed herself to revisit the divorce papers she had placed earlier into an old book. She had not taken them out since the night she tucked them away. Now, in the stillness before dawn, she opened the book and held the papers as if examining a relic. The word divorce sat on the top sheet like a history. She could sign them. She could make the final decisive cut. Instead, she placed them back on the shelf and closed the book. It wasn't that all wounds had healed.
She had nightmares, small flashbacks to being fragile and disoriented in Elliot's arms, to the way the night had been blurred. She learned to keep boundaries. Elliot had learned not to let his silence become a substitute for speech. There had been conversations, long and awkward, about consent and respect and the ways they would move forward. They had recalibrated. He asked for consent the way one learns to ask how someone takes their coffee. Often, always. The small rituals grew into proofs. A post-it on her bathroom mirror that said a trivial joke, a midnight text with a photograph of the city from a window he knew she liked, a reserved seat at the opera when she had said she had been curious, a photograph of a slightly mangy stray they both had seen outside their building, with a note that said, "Remember to be kind." It was not sweeping. It was everything. One evening, months after the night that had been both a collapse and a hinge, a minor hearing wrapped with the court handing down preliminary orders that froze some of Lang's assets and appointed a special receiver to oversee the contested Westmere land. The legal victory was provisional, but vital. The board convened for a quiet dinner to mark the progress. The city outside glittered like an audience applauding through glass. Nicole sat across from Elliot, his profile soft in the candlelight. He reached across the table and took her hand, eyes steady. "You didn't have to stay," he said, not as an accusation, but as an honest statement. "No," she agreed, "I didn't, but I wanted to see whether someone would choose me when it wasn't easy." He smiled then, the kind of smile that had become familiar, and it held 1,000 small years of choosing. "I kept a list," he said softly. "You know that." "I know," she answered. "I read the tickets." "This is a new entry," he continued, a little embarrassed. "For staying through meetings you hated, and for asking questions no one else did. For showing up in a room that tried to tell you to be silent." Nicole blinked. "That's hardly poetic." "It is to me," he said. "And it's a choice I make again." She squeezed his hand in a small affirmative pressure. They left the dinner and walked home beneath the city lights. It was a walk that felt like other walks they'd taken in earlier, less complicated phases of their life together, but the air around them now was different, richer, not in money, but in knowledge. They had survived an attempt at theft of their heritage. They had not simply weathered it. They had responded with evidence and law. They had done it together. He stopped at the doorway of their building and turned to her. "There are a lot of things I need to change," he said. "Ways I chose silence when I should have spoken. Ways I thought my protection would feel like kindness. I'm sorry for the times I made you feel boxed in." She answered honestly. "I felt boxed in because I thought you were choosing for me."
"I needed to know you wanted to share the heavy parts. I needed to know I wasn't alone when the storms came. So stay," he said, not making a demand but offering himself, "because you want to." She looked at him, really looked, and in that look she catalogued the past months, the recording, the hearings, the nights in the hospital, the quiet gestures that anchored her. She remembered the folder of Polaroids and the sticky notes he'd saved. She remembered the night that had been the hinge, not clean, not pure, but real in its consequences. She remembered feeling in the end that choice was less about choosing a man and more about choosing partnership. "I will stay," she said, and the words were full of the gravity they deserved. "I will stay because I choose you." He pulled her into his arms then, in a way that was no longer desperate or clinging, but deliberate and mutual. The embrace was long and steady, not an erasure of pain, but an agreement. They broke apart, and he kissed her gently on the forehead, the kind of kiss that said promises without rhetoric. After that night, after the night when the papers had trembled in her hand and the aftertaste of compromise had been bitter, she never mentioned divorce again. She had tried to leave once. She had learned to stay another way. The difference was fundamental. She stayed not because fear or inertia kept her, but because truth and choice and evidence of devotion had convinced her that their life together could be reshaped. The months that followed were not tidy. Lang contested charges in court. Civil suits moved at a glacial pace, and the damage to reputations had real costs. Edmund Kingsley never returned to full health, and that was a sorrow that neither money nor conviction could heal wholly. Thomas Hart faced inquiries about past arrangements. Zoe navigated public criticism with a narcissistic resolve that was both infuriating and familiar. Families, in their own way, are a kind of ongoing workplace hazard. But in the quiet corners of their home, in the ways they arranged their mornings, and the midnights they chose to be awake together, the small proofs accumulated. Elliot's decade-long devotion had revealed itself not as a melodramatic grab for her heart, but as a practice of choosing her. His sacrifices had become visible, the calls he made, the lengths he went to shield her from ballast she had never asked for, the list he kept because memory was where he kept love. Nicole understood now that love for Elliot had been patient, sometimes flawed, but consistently present. She understood the value of staying, not as surrender but as deliberate commitment. She had agency now in the story. She had helped expose criminals. She had testified in hearings. She had refused to be silent. Her choice to remain was her own, informed by evidence and by the daily acts of a man who had, for 10 years, quietly chosen her. In the weeks after Lang's arrest, the house grew easier to inhabit.
There were more mornings where the radio played something cheerful. There were quieter nights where they sat together and read separate books in a single shared silence. There were text messages in the middle of the day with inside jokes. There was care, not flashy, but solid. On a late afternoon, while the city edged toward fall, Nicole found the old book on the shelf again. This time she did not look for the papers. Instead, she took down the folder of Polaroids Elliot had once kept and sat on the couch, turning them over slowly. She smiled at a faded image of a rain-slicked walk and at a ticket stub scrawled with a date. She fingered a scrap of paper with his handwriting that read, "For when you doubt me." The paper felt like an artifact of the life they'd lived up to that point. Messy, complicated, and human. She knew there would be continuing battles ahead, civil litigation, slow healing, and the work of reimagining boundaries. But she also knew the shape of the man beside her, a strategist who had learned to be tender, a billionaire who had learned to ask for consent, a husband who had constructed his devotion in small, steady acts for a decade. She put the photographs into a new box and labeled it in a simple hand, "Reasons to Choose." She placed it on a shelf where it belonged, beside their shared passports, the list of emergency contacts, and a small wooden figurine of a boat they'd once laughed about buying as a ridiculous idea. Elliot found her there and slid in beside her. He didn't reach for the papers. He reached for her, fingers interlacing with hers as if they had rehearsed the move for years, and it still felt new. "For what it's worth," he said, "I don't want to buy your silence with save the dates and private lists. I want to earn the right to be chosen every day." "That's a lot of trouble," she teased, nudging him. "It's inconvenient love," he said, "but it's sincere." She laughed, and it was warm and unguarded. "That's enough," she said, leaning into him. Later, when they closed the curtains and the city became an array of distant lights, Elliot reached for a small wooden box on the coffee table and opened it. Inside was a ticket stub to an old film they'd loved, the same one he had saved years ago. He handed it to her like an offering that had been waiting a long time to be acknowledged. Nicole took the ticket, and as she read the scribbled annotation, an inside joke they had both forgotten, she felt the truth settle into her chest in a way that wasn't dramatic but steady. It wasn't the kind of declaration that rewrote history. It was the kind that confirmed the future. A life they would build together, imperfectly, choosing each other in the ordinary ways people make love real. "After that night," she said softly, echoing the old sentence Elliot had once whispered, "I never mentioned divorce again."
He kissed her then, tender and deliberate, a mutual act of consent and affection that sealed a new covenant between them, one not of obligation, but of choice. She hadn't been convinced by one night or one note. She had been convinced by a decade of small things, by a public fight for truth, and by the man who chose to stand beside her when it mattered most. Outside, life kept spinning. There would be more legal pages to turn and more adjustments to make. But inside their small domestic sphere, a new chapter had begun, one where love was measured in lists and lab reports, in courtrooms and late-night coffees, in 1,000 tiny acts of attention that proved devotion far more persuasively than any single grand gesture ever could. If you've been moved by their story and want more slow-burn twists and heartfelt reckonings, subscribe for the next tale. There are always more secrets hiding in the margins of fortunes, and more people learning to choose in the quiet aftermath.